The brutal truth has hit like a sledgehammer. Keir Starmer's so-called diplomatic prowess has been exposed for the fantasy it always was. The United States has just crushed the UK with devastating tariffs, and Starmer, after all his posturing, all his handshakes and rehearsed smiles with Trump, has been left standing like a fool, completely powerless. Remember when he strutted back from Washington in February, that smug grin plastered across his face, as if he had just secured Britain's future on the world stage? His team sold us a narrative, the idea that Starmer had charmed Trump, that he had somehow built a special bond, a backdoor relationship that would shield the UK from the brutal realities of international trade wars. Well, that bubble has spectacularly burst, and the wreckage is there for all to see. Let's get straight to the point. A 25% tariff on British steel and aluminium, slapped down without hesitation, without discussion, without even a 24-hour grace period. Nothing. The UK was treated exactly the same as every other country, making a complete mockery of Starmer's diplomatic theatre. But here's where it gets even worse. During their joint press conference, a journalist had the audacity to ask the burning question: had Starmer managed to convince Trump to spare Britain from these tariffs? Trump didn't hesitate. He simply smirked and said, he tried, before the room erupted into laughter. Two words that exposed the entire delusion. This wasn't a partnership of equals. This wasn't a prime minister securing his nation's interests. This was a humiliation of historic proportions. And as if that wasn't enough, Trump openly mocked Starmer's accent on the world stage. "What a beautiful accent," he said, grinning. "I'd have been president 20 years ago if I had that accent." Make no mistake, this was not a compliment. It was mockery, pure and simple. Trump was making it painfully clear: Starmer might sound impressive, he might present well, but he has absolutely no substance. Meanwhile, real leaders were actually doing their jobs. While Starmer was busy playing at diplomacy, Europe was assembling an ironclad response. The EU immediately announced a coordinated, multi-billion-euro counterstrike, hitting American exports right where it hurts. 26 billion euros in retaliatory tariffs, aimed with precision at industries that would politically damage Trump. Bourbon, motorbikes, key industrial products, all strategically chosen to make Washington feel the pain. And what was Starmer's response? Nothing. Silence. Empty rhetoric. Think about it. While Europe stood shoulder to shoulder in defiance, Britain was completely isolated. A nation adrift, led by a man who believed in his own legend, only to be publicly outplayed and humiliated. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the call from hell happened. Let's paint the scene. March 10th. With just 48 hours left before these tariffs would hammer British industry, Starmer made a desperate phone call to the White House. A last-ditch effort, a plea for mercy from a man who had completely lost control of the situation. The outcome? Catastrophic. According to sources who were familiar with the call, Trump dominated the entire 40-minute conversation, barely even acknowledging Starmer's desperate appeals about the tariffs. Instead, Trump did what Trump always does. He talked about himself, his campaign, his own agenda. Starmer didn't even get a word in. This was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, reduced to a bystander in his own crisis. It's like showing up to a job interview and having the interviewer spend the entire time talking about their golf game. You weren't even in the conversation. And yet, in the aftermath, Downing Street tried to spin it. They released a statement calling the call productive. Productive? Sources in Washington had a very different take. One senior White House official reportedly described Starmer as catastrophically out of his depth. Another simply remarked, "He earned whatever the hell they pay him over there." That's the reputation our Prime Minister now has in Washington. A political lightweight. A leader who thought he had influence, only to be laughed out of the room. And the cost of this failure? £2.7 billion of British exports now face brutal tariffs. British steel producers are watching their contracts evaporate in real time. Workers in towns like Port Talbot are wondering if they'll still have jobs next month. Yet when Starmer stood up in PMQs on March 12th, did he take responsibility? Did he offer a concrete plan? No. He hid behind empty phrases, telling Parliament all options are on the table. We all know what that means. It means he has no idea what to do next. It's diplomatic malpractice of the highest order. The EU was already in motion, hitting back with billions in counter-tariffs, while Starmer was still standing there, hoping that his charm offensive might somehow work on a man who publicly humiliated him. And here's the worst part. European officials are actually laughing at us behind closed doors. Multiple diplomatic sources have confirmed that Brussels sees Starmer's approach as naive and self-defeating. One senior EU diplomat reportedly described Britain's strategy as surrendering before the battle even starts. They're right to laugh. Britain looks weaker than it has in decades. And weakness has consequences. Because here's what Starmer doesn't understand. Trump respects strength, not weakness. Europe showed strength, and Trump knows it. He must now think twice before escalating against the EU, because they've shown they will hit back hard. Britain. Trump knows he can push the UK around without consequence. He saw Starmer's isolation, his lack of leverage, and his desperation, and he exploited it. And what about the workers paying the price? The British steel industry sends 9% of its total production to the US. Billions of pounds in exports. Contracts are being cancelled as we speak. Entire industries are on the brink. And yet, Starmer still doesn't have a plan. While the EU and Canada fought back immediately, Britain has done nothing. While European steel producers know their governments are protecting them, British workers have been abandoned. And the reason is simple. Starmer fundamentally misread the game. He thought diplomacy was about pleasantries. He thought that a good handshake and a well-rehearsed speech would buy Britain special treatment. But Trump doesn't respect charm. He respects power. And Britain, under Starmer, has none. So now the question is this: how much more will British workers and industries have to sacrifice before Starmer wakes up to reality? Because right now, we're watching a government sleepwalk into an economic catastrophe, blind to the consequences, trapped in the delusion that a prime minister with no leverage can negotiate from a position of weakness. This isn't just a diplomatic failure. It's a warning sign. A signal that Britain, under Starmer, is becoming an easy target on the world stage. And if we don't wake up fast, the consequences will be far worse than just tariffs on steel. So, this is what it's come to: Keir Starmer, exposed, humiliated, powerless. His so-called special relationship with Trump? A complete fantasy. His diplomatic finesse? Non-existent. And his ability to protect British industry? Utterly laughable. The reality is now undeniable. Starmer is out of his depth, and Britain is paying the price. Just picture the scene. Trump, standing at the podium, a smirk spreading across his face, as he mocked Starmer's accent for the world to hear. What a beautiful accent. I'd have been president 20 years ago if I had that accent, he said, with that signature grin that lets you know he's enjoying every second of the humiliation. It wasn't a compliment. It was a power play. A way of saying, nice voice, shame about the substance. Because, when it comes down to it, Trump doesn't care how polished you sound, he cares about how much power you wield. And here's the problem. Starmer wields none. While the world watched, his team in London was still pushing the delusion. They wanted us to believe that Starmer was such a brilliant diplomat, so uniquely talented, that Trump would spare Britain from his trade war. That our Prime Minister had some secret leverage, some behind-the-scenes influence, that would mean the UK wouldn't face the same brutal economic penalties as everyone else. But here's the cold, hard truth. Starmer's government got nothing. No reduced tariffs. No exemptions. Not even a delayed implementation. The UK was treated like every other country, stripped of the so-called special relationship that successive prime ministers had tried to cultivate. And yet, Starmer actually thought he was different. Why? Because he fundamentally misread the game. He overestimated his own importance on the world stage. He thought that being a lawyer somehow made him qualified for high-stakes international diplomacy. He believed, in his own arrogance, that a few staged photo ops and a handshake in front of the cameras would be enough to secure Britain's economic future. It was never going to be enough. Because, while Starmer was busy playing at diplomacy, Europe was taking action. Real leaders were actually doing their jobs. The European Union wasted no time. While Starmer was still making excuses, Brussels had already assembled a coordinated, multi-billion euro counterstrike. The EU announced 26 billion euros in retaliatory tariffs, specifically designed to target industries that would hurt Trump politically. Bourbon, motorbikes, key industrial products, all chosen with surgical precision to hit his support base where it matters. And it wasn't just Europe. Canada came out swinging too, announcing $29.8 billion in countermeasures, hitting the US with tariffs on steel, aluminium, electronics, and even sports equipment. That's how you play the game. You don't sit there begging for mercy, hoping that a handshake will be enough to protect your country's economy. You hit back. Hard. And you make sure your adversary knows that there will be consequences for economic aggression. But Britain? What did we do? Absolutely nothing. And why? Because Keir Starmer doesn't understand power politics. While our European allies stood shoulder to shoulder, presenting a united front, Britain was left isolated, weakened, humiliated. And the consequences? They are devastating. £2.7 billion of British exports, including steel and aluminium, are now under crippling tariffs. Factories are already losing contracts. Manufacturing towns, already struggling, now face the prospect of job losses on a massive scale. And yet, Starmer still doesn't have a plan. When he stood up in PMQs, what did he offer? A clear strategy? A countermeasure? A plan to fight back? No. Instead, he gave meaningless, empty phrases. He told Parliament, all options are on the table. We all know what that means. It means he doesn't have a clue what to do next. It's a disaster of historic proportions. And the world has noticed. Because behind closed doors, European officials are laughing at us. Multiple diplomatic sources have confirmed that Brussels sees Starmer's approach as naive and self-defeating. One senior EU diplomat reportedly summed it up in a single phrase. The UK has surrendered before the battle even started. They're right to laugh. Because Britain looks weaker than it has in decades. And weakness has consequences. Here's the brutal reality. Trump only respects strength. Europe showed strength. And Trump knows it. Which is why he will think twice before escalating against the EU, because he knows they will hit back hard. But Britain? Trump knows he can push the UK around without consequence. He saw Starmer's isolation. He saw his lack of leverage. He saw his desperation. And he exploited it. Because that's how the world works. And yet, Starmer is still clinging to this delusion that his diplomatic charm offensive will somehow fix everything. It won't. And here's what should terrify every British worker: the worst is yet to come. The UK steel industry sends 9% of its total production to the US. That's billions of pounds in exports. And right now, those contracts are being shredded in real time. Workers in Port Talbot, in Sheffield, in Scunthorpe, they are watching their livelihoods disappear. They are watching the very industry that their towns rely on collapse. And what is Starmer doing? He's still standing there, mumbling about diplomacy, pretending that negotiations which don't even exist will somehow save British industry. Meanwhile, the EU and Canada have already announced billions in countermeasures. And Britain? Nothing. Not a single meaningful response. Because Starmer doesn't get it. He thought diplomacy was about pleasantries. He thought that a good handshake and a well-rehearsed speech would buy Britain special treatment. But Trump doesn't respect charm. He respects power. And Britain, under Starmer, has none. So now the question is this: how much more will British workers and industries have to suffer before Starmer wakes up to reality? Because right now, Britain is being played. And if we don't wake up fast, the consequences will be far worse than just tariffs on steel. You thought Keir Starmer's humiliation couldn't get any worse? Think again. Because if being laughed at by Trump on live television wasn't enough, if being completely outmaneuvered on the world stage didn't already expose his glaring weaknesses, then what happened next sealed it. The call from hell. A last-minute, desperate attempt to salvage what was already a sinking ship. March 10th, just 48 hours before the US tariffs on British steel and aluminium came into force. A phone call to the White House that was meant to be Starmer's moment to prove his worth, to show that he could stand up to Trump, to secure some sort of concession for the UK. Instead, it turned into a diplomatic train wreck. According to sources close to the conversation, it was an unmitigated disaster. Starmer, scrambling to claw back even the smallest bit of leverage, was completely steamrolled. For 40 excruciating minutes, Trump dominated the call, barely even acknowledging Starmer's concerns about the tariffs. He talked about himself, his re-election campaign, his victories, his enemies. And Starmer, he could barely get a word in. This is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, reduced to a spectator in his own crisis. A man who thought he could charm his way out of an international trade war, now stuck on a call where he was treated like an afterthought. And the consequences? Immediate. Devastating. Unforgivable. Contracts cancelled overnight. British steel and aluminium industries, already fragile, thrown into complete turmoil. £2.7 billion in UK exports now strangled by tariffs. The impact wasn't theoretical, it was happening in real time. And yet, Downing Street, in its usual fashion, tried to spin the catastrophe. Within hours, they were pushing the absurd narrative that the call had been productive. Productive? According to sources inside the White House, it was anything but. One senior official, speaking anonymously, described Starmer as catastrophically out of his depth. Another, more bluntly, remarked that Starmer had earned whatever the hell they pay him over there, a withering indictment of his political competence. This is how Britain's Prime Minister is being spoken about in Washington. Not as a statesman, not as an equal, but as a political lightweight who thought he had influence, only to be completely dismissed. And the humiliation didn't end there. On March 12, just 2 days later, Starmer faced PMQs, where he had to answer for this diplomatic fiasco. And how did he respond? With a clear strategy? A decisive plan of action? A bold countermeasure to protect British industry? No. Instead, he hid behind meaningless, empty phrases. All options are on the table. That's political code for I have no idea what to do next. The chamber knew it. The opposition knew it. Even his own party knew it. Because while European leaders had already responded with billions in counter-tariffs, while Canada had moved immediately to defend its industries, Britain had done absolutely nothing. And the world noticed. Because make no mistake, Britain is being laughed at. Not just by Trump, not just by American officials, but by our own European allies. Multiple diplomatic sources have confirmed that Brussels considers Starmer's handling of the situation as naive and self-defeating. One senior EU diplomat was even quoted saying, "The UK has surrendered before the battle even started." And that's exactly what's happened. Because Starmer doesn't understand power politics. He thought he could handle Trump with a handshake, a polite conversation, some well-rehearsed talking points. But Trump doesn't respect charm. He respects strength. And Starmer has shown none. That's why the US had no hesitation in slapping a 25% tariff on British steel and aluminium. They knew there would be no consequences. No retaliation. No price to pay. Britain, under Starmer, was weak. And weakness invites exploitation. This is what happens when you mistake performative diplomacy for real-world negotiation. While the EU retaliated immediately, securing €26 billion in counter-tariffs, while Canada hit back with $29.8 billion in their own measures, Britain remained paralyzed, isolated, and completely exposed. And what does that mean for British workers? For the very industries that were relying on their government to protect them? Disaster. The UK steel industry sends 9% of its total production to the US. That's billions of pounds in exports, and now those contracts are being shredded in real time. Factories in Port Talbot, Sheffield, Scunthorpe, communities that have already been battered by economic decline, are now facing even more job losses. And what is Starmer doing? Still talking about diplomacy, still pretending that negotiations that don't even exist will somehow save British industry. This isn't just incompetence. It's negligence. Because while European steel producers know their governments are fighting for them, British steelworkers have been left to fend for themselves. And the worst part? The nightmare isn't over. Because the truth is, this is just the beginning. Trump now knows he can push Britain around without consequence. He saw Starmer's weakness. He saw his desperation. And he exploited it with surgical precision. Do you really think he's going to stop here? If Starmer doesn't wake up, if Britain doesn't start fighting back, then this will be the first of many economic blows to come. This isn't just a trade dispute anymore. It's a warning shot. Britain, under Starmer, has sent a very clear message to the world that we are no longer a serious player in global politics, that we can be ignored, dismissed, manipulated, and unless something changes, unless we start acting like a nation that will defend its industries, its workers, its economy, then this won't just be a diplomatic failure. It will be an economic disaster of historic proportions.